Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just one more minute. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Employee Ownership, a Business Succession and Retention Strategy. Thank you so much for being here for this important discussion about employee ownership as a tool for business succession, for employee attraction and retention, and for saving business owners from burnout too. There are a lot of reasons that people transition to employee ownership. So before we get started, I would like to introduce myself and then we'll go through some housekeeping items. So I'm Courtney Berner. I'm the Executive Director of the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives. We are a Wisconsin-based organization that does outreach, education, and research on the cooperative business model. And we help start new co-ops and help people transition their businesses to the cooperative model. This webinar today is also sponsored by MCDC, the Madison Cooperative Development Coalition, Wisconsin Center for Employee Ownership, and UW Extension. So today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. Participant lines are muted. This is a webinar format, so we will have a robust discussion that will be followed by Q&A, but please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A box throughout the course of the webinar, but we will hold taking those questions until the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted at the UWCC website and shared out with everyone who registered. We had great turnout, over 250 people registered for this event today, so we know there's a lot of interest in this topic. All right, so we just want to give a little bit of context before we launch into the discussion with our panelists today. So you're likely here because you know that we're in the process of a large business transition in our country. In Wisconsin alone, baby boomers own half of all privately held businesses. It's approximately 50,000 businesses in the state of Wisconsin that have an owner who will likely want to retire in the next 5 to 10 years. And as you will hear from our presenters today, retirement isn't the only reason a business owner might be thinking about selling to their employees, but it certainly is an important one at this moment in our country. So I want to make sure that folks have a basic understanding of the 3 types of broad-based employee ownership structures. We're really going to focus on 2 today, but there are 3 that are being used in the US right now quite extensively. So the first is employee stock ownership plans, more often known as ESOPs. They are the most common form of employee ownership in the United States. There are about 7,000 of them. An ESOP is a federally governed plan, like a 401k or a profit sharing plan, that can be used to share ownership with the employees. So when an ESOP is created, and you'll hear more about this and the specifics, the business owner sells some or all of their shares to an ESOP trust, which owns those shares on behalf of the employees. ESOPs are a little bit more expensive to set up and maintain, and thus they tend to be a better fit for larger companies. The second type I want to mention is worker cooperatives, and worker cooperatives are companies that are owned and democratically controlled by the employees. Ownership is usually, but not always, open to all employees after they've met certain thresholds. Worker cooperatives are much less common than ESOPs, but they are growing quickly. The US Federation of Worker Cooperatives' latest State of the Sector report suggested that there are now over 600 worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces in the US, which is more than a 30% jump since 2019. I also want to briefly mention employee ownership trusts, which is the main form of employee ownership in the UK, but is relatively new in the United States. Employee ownership trusts are a non-retirement structure trust structure, excuse me, that ensures perpetual employee ownership of a company. The company's shares go into a trust and stay there forever. And the company is operated by the trustee on behalf of the employees, much like an Esop company. So that was a really quick overview of those three types. We'll be mostly focused on worker cooperatives and ESOPs today, but wanted to make sure everyone had sort of a basic understanding of, again, those three types of broad-based employee ownership. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers, and I'll invite them to turn on their cameras. Today's discussion will be moderated by Steve Storkin. Steve has been involved with employee stock ownership plans for over 25 years, and he currently serves as the executive director of the Employee Ownership Expansion Network, which he launched in 2019 with the goal of significantly expanding employee ownership across the US, mainly through the establishment and providing support to a network of independent nonprofit state centers for employee ownership. And that's how I've gotten to know Steve over the last year as we've worked together to help establish the Wisconsin Center for Employee Ownership, which just incorporated earlier in 2022. Next, I'd like to introduce Gina Schaefer, who is the founder and CEO of 13 hardware stores in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, and the surrounding areas. When I lived in D.C., I actually frequented the Logan Circle Ace Hardware store. So as a member of Ace Hardware, which is also a cooperative, Gina leads a multi-million-dollar business that employs more than 250 people. And last July, she began transferring ownership of that business to her teammates through an ESOP. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Marty Reddy, who is the founding owner of Terra Firma Building and Remodeling, a construction firm located in St. Paul, Minnesota. After being the sole owner of the business for about 13 years, he sold the business to his employees in 2013. And that worker cooperative is now has 31 employees, 18 of whom are worker owners. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers today and to thank them for spending some of their day with us.
Thanks, Courtney. I appreciate it. Very good summary of a very complex topic of employee ownership. And I wanted to start by saying that a lot of times in these webinars and seminars, people want to know the details of how to convert to a worker cooperative and how to create an ESOP and how do the shares transfer and a lot of the transactional things. And if you are interested in that, we certainly can do a follow-up webinar. I'll put my email address in the chat. I think there'll be a follow-up survey and we can go deeper. But the purpose of today is to give you a feel for what two different worker-owned businesses, what they've gone through, what their story is, the journey to employee ownership, and really from, we have such a great opportunity to hear directly from the owner. So we're going to stay at a really high level, but I think you're going to get some really great information about why and how and retention and a lot of great things. So with that, I'm just going to kick it off and we're just going to get a real quick overview from Gina and Marty on their business, the history of the business, how it started, and stop them before they get to the employee ownership journey, but kind of, just tell us a little bit, Gina, where you started, how you got into this business, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point, depending on where you are. I was a technology reject. I got laid off for three times from technology jobs and decided that in the growing community that I lived in here in Washington, D.C., I wanted to start the local hardware store. So I approached the Ace Hardware Cooperative. That was in 2002. 2003, I opened my first location. 2005, my second one, and then the sky was sort of the limit from there. My business partner is my husband. He joined me after I opened that first location. And like Courtney said, we've grown to over 250 employees, 13 locations now. And in July of last year, started that ownership transfer. I'm going to stop because I know you wanted us to be brief, Steve, and stop at the ownership piece. So.
Right. And we will, we'll come right back to that. And
okay.
Marty, same thing, just a little history of how you got into the business and before employee ownership.
That sounds great. I started out actually, my first business was in Costa Rica and I did adventure travel trips. That was really where my heart was. But I could not make a living doing it. And I tried it for 4 years. I worked my tail off and I would come back for months at a time and do construction in Minnesota. And then eventually, I kind of realized I needed to have a more sustainable living. And so I committed full time to construction. did that, and the company just kind of grew by a few employees a year. Everybody was very passionate and committed, and we ran the company very democratically. And I asked everybody to really bring an owner mentality to it, but they didn't have actual ownership. So we did that for 13 years, and then we made a transition, and I'll stop there. But I should say too, it's building and remodeling, custom building, custom remodeling. I should say that.
Okay, I was just going to ask that follow-up question. You're doing a lot of you're in homes a lot, doing remodeling in homes, correct?
Yeah, we're working in people's homes. We're part of the family. We're, very intimate with what their, biggest investment in their lives are. And we just recently started a cabinet division too. That's another little side thing we have going too. So yes.
So Courtney talked about the silver tsunami. I know some people don't like the word silver tsunami, so I shouldn't use it anymore. But the aging business owners, there's, I think 3 million in the United States who are over the age of 55 who are looking for exit. COVID has significantly accelerated that for different reasons. Some business owners are coming out of COVID saying, I never want to go through that again. I should really do what people have been telling me for a long time, and that is exit planning. And there's others that are saying, no, my business is worth more than ever. Maybe now's a good time to take some chips off the table. But both of you are not in that mode. Marty, you were 13 years ago or so, and Gina just recently. So I'll start with you, Gina. Just can you give you can go into the employee ownership piece now. What caused you to start thinking about selling your business? And then what was important to you? I think that's going to drive you into employee ownership. We can talk about the steps of employee ownership later, but let's just preface it by the story of how you got into the idea of selling your business or a portion of your business.
One of the benefits that I had as being part of the Ace Hardware Cooperative is that I had all of the demographics from the time I started. And I was always told, the average Ace store owner was X age, and this is the percentage that had a succession plan. And when I opened my first store, I was 31. So not in my brain, not old enough to think about retirement, certainly. And I was just starting my business. But people immediately started saying, what's your exit strategy? What's your exit strategy? And coming from the tech world, it made a lot of sense. You build a business and you sold it, 15 seconds later to a private equity company. So I think from early on, very different from a lot of my generational peers in the business, I had in the back of my mind, I want to figure out how I'm not going to be in this business until I'm 85 years old, which is very typical in hardware. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I didn't think that's where I wanted to be. So people were asking me all of the time, what's your exit strategy? And then if you fast forward to things that started happening in 2018, 19, 20, pre-pandemic, all of the protests, all of the civil unrest, and because I'm here in Washington, D.C., I feel like we felt it very acutely. My husband and I started talking about how we could somehow be part of the solution. What is it that we were going to try and do as a legacy for our business with our team? And for us, that eventually came to mean we're going to sell it to the employees. And so what started as hey, don't become this typically generational business that doesn't have a succession, turned into, what is that succession? How do you make it part of some societal solution, if you will?
And so it was less about, I'm going to sell to receive proceeds to go do something else. There was an emotional piece behind when you started thinking about selling your business.
Yeah, there was a very emotional piece. I mean, there's also a funny piece. My dad retired at 55, and I always swore that I would beat him to retirement. I don't plan on technically ever retiring, but in this particular role, I wanted to make sure that we had a clear and concise plan. Yes.
Okay. And Marty, how about you? How old were you when you started thinking of when this all started coming down? And what were you thinking? You said you had democratic workplace, and I think you wanted turn that ownership mentality into reality, right? I think that's what you and I talked about.
Yeah, exactly. I would say we first read John Abrams' book, The Company We Keep, in 2010. So I would have been 40 at the time. And that's an eye-opening book. It was for me, and I would encourage other folks to read that. He's got a couple of books out there. It tells the story of his journey. And I could see that was going to be a path for us to be able to retain employees. Kind of the way it works in in my line of business is people generally kind of spin off and start their own thing, and you kind of lose your top talent. And I could see that we could really reach a much better potential, much greater potential as a group if we could stay together. And so I saw that as a means to entice people to stay together and kind of strengthen our company, and then also strengthen individual efforts. I think the second part of it was actually the personal part of it. And, Gina shared that story about her dad and being into retirement. And I think that is true. There's a real personal element of it for me. And my wife and I were seeing like a financial therapist in town who she's well known, and she's on NPR. And she said, most successful entrepreneurs, when they're seeing me here, they're on their, maybe their third marriage, and they're estranged from their kids. And I get it. Like, you're married to your business, and I was working, easily 60 hours a week, and we just were having our first baby, and I kind of wanted to stay to have that first marriage be lasting. And I was like, I think if I can share some of the responsibility with my employees, then and share with the successes and the rewards too, it might allow my personal life to be more fulfilling. So that was a big part of it for me.
I think you mentioned something that a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, but that happens a lot of time, which is you wanted to shift responsibility, but not every owner is willing to shift ownership to make that happen. A lot of times it's like, okay, I don't want to be 60 hours, so I'm just going to put that on my employees. I'm going to have some succession. But I think what I see in other employee-owned companies is that the owner realizes that having a stake in the game and having some equity is so important to make that happen. It's not just responsibilities and a higher paycheck. I think the equity is there. And we'll talk a little bit about retention strategies and how that works as well. Gina, you're just getting into this, so we may not have a lot of stories on retention, but I'm sure you'll have some ideas. Gina, can you tell me a little bit about how you got down the path of employee ownership, just maybe your journey to employee ownership, how you found out about it, the importance of a good team? Let's start to get into that transition, because I think there's a lot of people on the call that have thought about it and have questions about, what do I do? What's my first step? How do I get there?
One of the absolute very first step is for everyone to understand that there's no money outlay from the employees in an ESOP. And when Mark, my husband, and I started exploring our options, that we didn't know that. It was always a roadblock for us, because we just assumed, and we hadn't bothered to find the answer, how an ESOP was funded. And then we were in Colorado at the brewery that owns the Fat Tire brand, New Belgium Brewery. And they, at the time, were an ESOP. And the associate who was giving us, the young woman who was giving us the tour, was just so enthusiastic about being an owner of that brewery that when we left Colorado, we decided we really needed to explore the option of an ESOP better. So the first thing we did, I think, was call Steve, actually, who set us straight on the who pays for what. And honestly, we felt like once we had that question answered, we could just take off. When you form an ESOP, you put together a team of consultants, trustees, attorneys, folks around you who are required as part of the process. It goes through a Department of Labor approval process. So we went through all of our due diligence in choosing who that team was going to be. And that started the valuation process of the current company as it stood, so we could figure out what our company was valued at. And I can stop there and see if you have a question, Steve, if that was the...
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just follow up with a couple questions, which was a clarification. Tell us how, if the employees didn't come to you and write checks, in a really brief, simple format, how did you get paid? How is that happening right now? Because your purchase, we probably didn't mention this, but the purchase of your company was for 30%, right?
Correct.
So you sold 30% of your company to the employees. Can you talk a little bit about how that payback process is working?
Yeah, and that was a huge educational process for us as well. We have since 2004, 2005 banked with National Cooperative Bank. I think Dami's on the call, and they are an amazing banking partner for us. They also understand ESOPs, which was super helpful. We got a loan for the 30% of the purchase from National Cooperative Bank. Mark and I did, which we then loaned to the business to pay us off. And so I always, when I'm explaining it, I always think it's this big circle. Bank, Gina and Mark get a loan, we give it to the business gives it back to us. The business holds the note and then pays the bank, for that loan on behalf of the employees, on behalf of the trust that holds the ESOP. And so that's where the 30% came from. And then that's how it's being paid back to the bank.
I think in its simplest form, people should know that there's a loan in an ESOP, and it's either the selling shareholder who loans the money or a bank is involved or both. And the easiest way to explain it is that as that loan is paid off, there's a lot of different moving parts, but as that loan is paid off, the shares that they bought are released over time. So if you have a loan for 15 or 20 years, every year that that's paid, those shares are released to the employees who are working there. It can get very confusing, but just know that the employees are not writing a check. It is a loan for that 30%.
Can I say something, Steve? I think one
Sure,
of the
go
things
ahead.
that I had to learn too was that you don't have to just sell 30%. You can sell 100% in one transaction if that's what you want. You can break that up into tranches that you're comfortable with or that financially makes sense for the business that you're running.
That's a great point. I think for a long time I did this. I was in this business since 1996, and there was a reason to sell 100% of your company to an ESOP, and I think a lot of companies went 100%. But there's a lot of people in your situation, Gina, who are kind of dipping your toe into to say, you know what, I do want to give my employees equity in the company. I want to see what happens. It doesn't mean that you have to sell the other 70%. You could get down at the end of the road and you could say, you know what, it makes more sense to sell it to another private equity or another firm. Maybe you're not going to go there, but if you do, the 30% will be going to the employee. So it's a way for you to get into employee ownership, not all at once, but you could have gone 100%.
Correct.
And Marty, your story is a little bit different from a worker cooperative standpoint. The structure is a little different. Did you sell 100% right out of the gate, or how did your transaction work?
It was 100%. And actually my understanding is that is actually a legal requirement with the type of business that we are, which is worker owned cooperative, that you can't do a partial.
Correct.
So, on November 1st, 2013, I went from having 100% ownership the day before to having one share. So I was the seller and then also one of the buyers. So I was in kind of an interesting position. So when we started out in 2013, we had 8 owners. So 8 kind of founding members of the cooperative. And I was one of those 8. And then I was also the seller. My wife and I sold the business to that cooperative.
So in that process, there was in a worker cooperative, unlike an ESOP, the buyers are the employees, and there is typically a small purchase price or a small buy-in. Can you talk a little bit about that and a little bit how you loan the money to the company?
Yeah, so there's 2 different things. One is the buy-in from the employee. And then another thing is the purchase of the business. So those are really 2 very different things. And that was something I had to get my head around. I suppose it could be structured in some situations where they are kind of linked, but in our situation, we kept that very separate. So the company currently is still buying the business from my wife and I. That was a 15-year loan, and we didn't get any banks involved. We just decided that we would finance the entire thing. So my wife and I had said, we will loan you the amount. The company was appraised at a certain amount, and then we decided what amount we wanted to sell it for, which was actually less than the appraised amount because we felt like we wanted to put the co-op in a really good spot to be able to succeed. And then we, worked on a agreed upon interest rate over those 15 years. And there are certain financial tax reasons why 15 years is a good amount. And that was on the advice of accountants that were helping us. And then we also did this kind of bridge loan also to the co-op, which was just an operations cash, because when they started out, they really didn't have any money. So we loaned them some kind of startup cash as well. But since I was the seller and the founder of the company, I knew the finances of the company super well. So I had like 100% confidence, like, hey, we'll nail this. It felt, there's some risk for us, but I was pretty confident that it was going to work out. Yeah. And then each member we followed the John Abrams model, which is the buy-in amount for a new owner, an incoming owner, is the price of a decent used car. That was kind of their way they've set up the structure. So we sort of aimed for that. I don't know that we've kept up with it. I feel like used cars have gone up a lot and we haven't really raised the price much. So it gets to be a better and better deal to buy in, but we vote on the buy-in amount every year.
So as a new employee, we go step forward just a little bit, but if I come work for you, I put in a certain amount of time. I can buy into the company and become an owner and have one share, one vote in the future, right? How does that work for you?
Yeah, so for us, there's about 10 requirements that you have to meet. The big ones are like you have to work here for 4 years.
Okay.
You have to submit a letter of intent. You have to show that you are committed to the core values of the company, that you intend to work here for the foreseeable future. You have to get 90% of the current owner's votes. So for approval, if you don't get it on your first try, we encourage people to try again. You have to be an exemplary employee and a committed employee, and the standards are high. And not everybody gets it the first time. And we say, hey, these are the things to work on. Here's what it could be: a personal issue. It could be a, some other, relationship, how you work with your coworkers, as opposed to just like, hey, I'm a really technically skilled carpenter, but I'm hard to work with. So anyways, we work through those things. And then the buy-in amount, you have to submit a check. So yeah, and then we actually, to even make it easier, we'll loan you the money at 0 interest over 3 years for half of the buy-in amount. So we're trying to not make that be an obstacle. Like, we want you to be an owner, and we don't want finances to be an obstacle. But you got to put some skin in the game, as they say.
And I think that's a really big differentiation between a worker cooperative and an ESOP. Gina, when you announced the ESOP to your workers, I'm sure they're all still scratching their head, because that was just over 12 months ago that you did that, right? And unlike a worker cooperative, they just become owners. They are receiving allocations of stock because they are putting in sweat equity. They don't have to have all of these other requirements. And so just a little feedback from you on how's that going? How was that announcement made? And what are they thinking? I was really impressed with your marketing. So if anybody wants to check it out, maybe Gina can put a link in, but they've done an amazing job already. So
thanks, Steve. It was last July, a little less than a year. So we actually haven't had our first valuation yet, which will actually show a dollar amount to the owners. We have there's some criteria that we set up, and that you have to have worked with us for 1 year and 1,000 hours in order to become an owner. So on that day in July, when we made the announcement, about 249, I think, teammates we had, 160 of them roughly became automatic owners in the company, co-owners in the company. Those were the folks who had been here with us for 1 year and 1,000 hours. And then we also, we were able to carve out anyone under 18, because those typically aren't people that make it to a year anyway, because they're just here for seasonal purposes or, college breaks. So we made the announcement. We worked with One America, which is a retirement plan provider that also really understands ESOPs. They came to a meeting with us to be on hand to explain to the associates what an ESOP means, how it's a slow retirement build, how they were going to help in this whole process. And so they were super instrumental. We just did a big kickoff meeting. I gave another brief history of the company. Folks knew about that. And then talked about where we were going down the road and why. What I hadn't anticipated, and maybe you'll get to this in a little bit, but what I hadn't anticipated is that a lot of folks thought that meant I was automatically leaving, or that Mark was automatically leaving. Mm-hmm. And honestly, it never occurred to me. I probably should have said up front, I'm not going anywhere. Until we can transition my role as CEO, I'm the CEO. Like, I'm, certainly planning on being here to at least in a figurehead position, if they give me credit for that, until I've been replaced. And so I should have said that up front in that meeting, because I think that caused some fairly quick consternation among the team.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's some questions roaming around here in the chat that talk a little bit about that concept of leaving and the change that's happening. And I think it is important that people are asking also what makes a good, what kind of business makes a good business for employee ownership. And in my experience over the last 25 years, I think the businesses that have an owner like both of you, who are, even if you're 5 years from retiring, and so you're farther down the road than both of you were, a business owner who's willing to stick around make sure that the business works, wants to, does this early enough, and then that's a profitable business that has a succession plan in place, an exit, a plan for what you're going to do to replace. And I know, Gina, you probably had that even before, and probably building it now, Marty, as well. But I think if you're asking the question on what makes a good business candidate for an employee ownership model, I think it has to be an owner that's willing to stay around for a little while, profitable, but most importantly is that they have that exit plan, succession team in place. So maybe, Marty, you could talk a little bit about how that's going over the last 13 years for you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an evolution for us. I would say right now, I'm pretty confident that if I walked out of here tomorrow and flew to Costa Rica and never came back, the business would do okay. They would be fine. It would be a little bit of a shock, but they'd be okay. The first couple of years, it would have been pretty tough. So we've come a long way since 2013. But I would say that is a pretty big focus for us right now, is to make sure that the definitions of everyone's roles are clear enough that we can fill them. And I mean, it's like Gina's nodding her head because she knows. She's like, yeah, like, how do I hand this off to somebody else? There's so much just knowledge that's floating around up here, and how do you get it on paper and train somebody? And it's going to be fine. Somebody will step in when the void's there, or in an ideal world, it's a really deliberate thing where we've really identified who that person is, and then when my official end date is, which I don't even know when that is. So yeah, that's a long answer, but Gina should probably, or Steve, back to you.
Go ahead, Gina, if anything you want to add on that.
I'll pause. No.
Okay. I think the last thing I will touch on when it comes to your transaction, and we'll talk about employees next and retention, a little bit about that, but a lot of times there's some misinformation out there that these structures are complex, they're expensive, and the owner doesn't get the value that they should. That they should just put a stake in the ground, just like selling a house. I'm going to put a stake in the ground. I'm going to sell my business. Someone's going to walk in, they're going to look at it, and they're going to say, they're going to walk in my house or walk in my business and say, yep, looks good. And they're going to write me a check. When in reality, it's even worse than selling a house. They come in, they open the drawers, they take the silverware out. I mean, they have to get in deep. So could you talk a little bit, Gina, about your experience in did you feel like you got a fair value? And what was the process like? I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say it wasn't complex and it wasn't expensive, but do you think it was any more expensive and intrusive than some other form? And maybe did you think of any other forms?
I love this question because my husband does all of the finances. And so I can say that it was easy as pie. We did give pies to all of our team and said, we're giving you your piece of the pie, which is how we made it,
cool.
Which was a lot of fun. But Mark had to deal with most of the finances. It is expensive. It is not inexpensive. However, there were several. So when I said that the first thing I wish I had known way back when was that the employees don't have an outlay of money. The second thing that we should have known or could have known is how much value there is in the tax benefits for an ESOP that allow you to go through the whole sales process with the peace of mind that you are not giving away your business. There is this misperception that you're selling it at a discount, or you're giving it away, or it's not fair market value. And the truth of the matter is we had the people going through the drawers and looking at all the closets. One was the consultant that we hired who did a fair market valuation independently of a trustee who is the representative of the ESOP, did his own fair market assessment of the value of our company. They came together to see if they were on the same page and if the people that you're working with are good business valuators. Is that even a word? You're going to come up with the true value of your company. It then goes to the Department of Labor to make sure that it's all on the up and up. We did not give our books to a private equity company to evaluate, but we have been told that with the tax benefits that we received, we would have had to have sold the business for 20% higher than our fair market valuation, because when you sell to a private equity company, you do not get those tax benefits. So for Mark and I, that was the real kicker. we weren't looking for 20% higher. We were looking for the right value for our company that was fair, and we felt like, you know, we've worked really hard and we want to make sure that we're not giving it away. But you are not giving away your business. You are professionally, there's a professional evaluation that's done from multiple parties.
And then the second part on the private equity, you know, there's private equity can be, you know, kind of a bad word in business selling for some people, and others it's not. And so I don't want to paint it as a bad picture. But for you, when you talk about the emotional piece, that just wasn't a path you were going to go down. You weren't going to sell 30% of your company to an outside buyer, or even sell 100% to an outside buyer. For you emotionally and the things that you wanted to accomplish, that was not going to work, which is why I love employee ownership.
Yeah, so we looked at a couple different options. We have private equity companies that call us a lot. So we spoke with several of them, and we have some ACE friends who have private equity relationships, and we've seen both good and bad. So we knew that there were some positives to the whole deal. One, that we could walk away with a full bucket probably in one day and not have to think about the next tranches. We talked about selling it to another ACE business owner, which was an option. We have gotten to a size in the ACE co-op that makes us a little bit harder of a purchase. And we operate, we don't think that we're different, but because we're in an urban environment, we operate within some different parameters logistically that make it really hard for a lot of other ACE store owners to grasp. And so we thought that it might be a hard bite for another hardware store owner to buy us. And so we did look at those two other options in addition to the ESOP.
Marty, who would have been a buyer for you? Maybe if you think about it, instead of at the point in your career when you did it, who would have been a buyer for you, let's say now at the age of, you know, in your 50s? Maybe my math wasn't right. Did you hit 50 yet, Marty?
Yeah, I'm almost 2 years into it.
All right. So who would be like, let's just think about it now. It's someone in your business, a great remodeling business, got a great succession plan, but more than likely the employees that you work with are not going to find the dollars to buy it from you. So who's a good buyer for you right now that you would have had to think about if employee ownership wasn't there?
I honestly, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't feel to me, I'm not, first of all, I'm not like really a kind of mergers and acquisitions and savvy about like who the buyers are. It's just like, we are such a small business. You know, we have just over 30 employees, and we're, it seems so specific to this group that I can't even imagine there being a different owner group. So I don't even know who would do that or how that would work. And it wouldn't feel right to me. And culturally, so to me, my first reaction is like, I don't think anybody else would. So that's a perfect answer, and I didn't tee that up for you, but okay. It's a perfect answer, because there are people on this call who are in the economic development world, or city managers, or, you know, not business owners, but people who are working with business owners. And the answer that you gave is perfect, because there is an option for a small business like you. Maybe it's not a worker cooperative, because maybe you don't have the democratic, you know, everybody wants to buy in. That sometimes it doesn't work for people of 30, you know, a size of like yours of 30 people. But there's probably an employee-owned company out there that might bring you in, an ESOP might bring you in, or another worker cooperative. There's so many different options, instead of you just saying, well, this was a great lifestyle business, and I know all of you are going to get great jobs. I'll connect you with other people, and you shut it down. And I just, if anybody leaves that's not a business owner, I just want them to know that there are options. It's why we do this. It's why we have the Wisconsin Center. It's why Courtney has, you know, the UWCC. I mean, we want people to know that. So. Yeah.
We have about 6 minutes left, and before we start answering questions, I'll start with you, Marty, because this is new to her. Can you tell me about employee retention? I think there's a lot of people want to know, is employee ownership the silver bullet to keep people from leaving? I think it can, and it's not a perfect answer, but just what's your experience on people leaving and staying? And do you think they stay longer and try to buy in more than if you did?
Yeah, no question that it's a big benefit of working here, and it's an appealing part of working here, and so people do tend to stay longer. We've had a couple owners leave recently, which has been interesting. One guy retired, and it was a little earlier than we expected. Another person moved out to Baltimore, actually, because his wife got a job out there that they couldn't pass up, and it's been really hard. In fact, he's been talking about like, well, can we start a Terra Firma Baltimore division? And that's been like this whole other conversation, which is like, oh my gosh, what does that look like? And anyways, it's a big part of employee retention. If someone wants to leave, of course, leave, but they tend to not want to leave because the financial benefits are big, and I think even more importantly, the community benefits are big, and it becomes a big part of people's lives, as any business owner knows.
I'm going to just ask you quickly. Someone has a question. I haven't gotten to the questions yet, but I did see a question that says, what happens when someone leaves? So Marty, as long as you mentioned that someone just recently left, you have an owner. How did that work from a payout standpoint? They had given you a check for $9,000. How did that work?
So the bylaws stipulate that we have 5 years to pay that $9,000 back. The precedent has been we've wanted to just get it off of our books and in their hands right away. So if we were in a situation where like we really needed that $9,000 and that initial member capital, we could stretch that out over a longer period of time. But we just assume like, hey, let's get that back in their hands. And another way to kind of say that the ownership is over. There's an internal capital account, which is a whole other thing that took me a while to wrap my head around, that now I'm super familiar with. People can call me or email me with questions about that, but that would get paid out at the scheduled amount, and that would happen over a series of years into the future. So they don't leave with their internal capital account money, but rather would get that on the scheduled amount as all the other owners in that business year.
Okay. And I think that's where we can maybe get into another webinar on specifics, but I think the most important thing to know about a worker cooperative is something we haven't mentioned is not only do you have equity, not only do you, feel like part of the business and all of that, there's a huge financial benefit, which is you are all sharing the profits in, every worker cooperative is different, but your bylaws talk about how you share profits in different ways, whether it's a profit sharing check that year that everybody shares in, it goes into a capital economy. And there's some significant, for a profitable worker cooperative, there's a significant financial benefit to being an owner, just like if it was you and your wife owning the business alone, you're dividing that up, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
And Gina, on your end, from an ESOP standpoint, the differentiation of an ESOP and a worker cooperative, as an employee in your ESOP, I receive a statement every year that tells me how many shares I receive for working there. You get a valuation each year of what those shares are worth, and I get a retirement account statement. So unlike this kind of profit sharing model where we share it every year, it's going into an account where I know what I have, and when I leave, I can turn that back in. And I know this is new for you, but you haven't done statements, but throw that out there for an ESOP.
We'll get our first statement, I think, in July. So those shares will be allocated the dollar value for those shares. And I think it should be anywhere between, it's a wide range right now, and we'll go through the first time and see, but anywhere between like 10 and 20 to 25%, I think, of an employee's salary will be the value. It vests 20% a year. So unless they were over 65, we have some folks who are over 65 and they'll automatically vest at 100%, but otherwise it will vest in 20% increments until they're fully vested. And then I assume this is like a worker co-op. Once an associate leaves the business or is terminated, they are not allowed to retain ownership in the company. And so we also, according to our bylaws, have 5 years to pay them out, just in case there's a huge exodus at some point. We can save some of that money or, sparse it out over the years.
Okay.
Parse it out.
And I'll just share this number with you. I work with a trucking company in Minnesota that used to be a client of mine, and I now sit on the board of directors, and we had a board meeting on Monday, and we just were wondering, they were started in 2013, and just as a number to throw out there, since 2013, they have paid out to 145 participants. Now, the trucking industry has a little bit of turnover. They've paid out $1.7 million in distributions to those employees over those first 13 years. It's significant dollars. And I'm sure, Marty, if you went through your books and figured out how much you had paid internally in capital accounts, when you share the wealth, we really do share the wealth. So that's why I do this every day. I just love to see that. And I think, one last question before we get to the questions is how does it change your employees' lives? How do you think people that are living in a community that have employee ownership should think about businesses and why they would want them to be employee owned? It's wealth, it's family. How would you describe that, Marty?
That's a good one. I mean, we were talking a lot about the money, and we've paid out a lot too. We just updated it with this year's payout. We're now at, since 2013, we're at 3.8 million that we've paid out. Yeah. So it's a huge amount of money, and we're right now at 18 owners. So and we, I think it makes a big difference in families' lives. And I think there is just something about being an owner that makes a difference and gives people their meaning to their work. That's hard to describe. It's certainly not a dollar value, but it is important, I think. And I believe in it. I think it's a great thing for individuals and their families. So I don't know how to describe it exactly, other than
most people don't. It's a feeling. You can't touch it or see it, but you can feel it. That's what I tell people about employee ownership.
Right. When I find the right words, I'll let you know, or if you do, let me know. So yeah, exactly. That's great. Yeah.
Gina, this is all brand new, but I'm sure you're seeing some change in behavior, some questions, and I'm excited to see where this goes and talk to you over the next 5-10 years. But any last points before we get to questions?
Yeah, I think our biggest tremendous appreciation. I mean, we've had such great conversations internally, and we've done, I think, a pretty good job, not as good as we can or will, in communicating it. It needs to be a constant communication. It's definitely not a one and done to the team, particularly for the fact that every month a new person rolls into the ownership portion. And so we want to make sure that we continue those conversations. Our biggest challenge has been figuring out how to differentiate between ownership and management. And by that, I mean, you might own shares, but you don't make any more decisions. And I hadn't anticipated that being a wrench, no pun intended. And so we're working on the communication structure and value around that concept. You are an owner in this business. We want you to act like one. These are the benefits of being one. But that doesn't mean that you're automatically a boss. And so that's, hopefully you will at some point. You can do another conversation like this just for someone who manages hourly wage employees. And all of the learnings that we have, and I'm sure we'll continue to have regarding that.
Well, thank you both. We'll have about 13 minutes here to answer questions, but Courtney, go ahead. We want to step in.
Yeah, your comment, Gina, is a really good segue to one of the questions that has come in. And we've talked a lot about money and wealth. We haven't talked as much about governance and control. And so there are some very key differences in terms of the governance model and the control of workers in an ESOP versus a worker cooperative. And then of course, quite a bit of variation even within worker co-ops and ESOP. So can you two touch a little bit, at least on your experience and what you've set up and what you've seen as the differences between those two models?
Yeah, I'll just say off the bat, we don't have a structure set up yet because Mark and I still own 70% of the business. So our back office team, our executive team, if you will, we have not changed our interaction with them, meaning it is frequent and robust, and they are just an incredible leadership team. So that hasn't officially changed in any way. We will have a board that is created at some point. And we haven't exactly decided what the makeup of that board is going to be, but that's probably going to happen when we sell the next tranche and get closer to being a less than 50% owner.
Great, thanks.
I think the governance part is that piece that I couldn't find words for, actually. It's being able to have a say in the direction of the company. We went from having a benevolent dictator before 2013, where I would engage with the employees, but really ultimately was the manager who always had the final say. I'm still the president and the company manager, and so I'm not ousted yet, but I have to get elected every year as to be the president. We're trying to distinguish. We have a management committee that meets once a month. And that's not the group that also runs the day-to-day operations of the company. And that's a real like ongoing discussion, is like, you know, we have field carpenters that are the vice president of the company, and they're out there pounding nails, and then they're, you know, how could they be expected to perform ongoing daily kind of minutia office management tasks? So like how that works is, but at the same time, there's a lot of people like, hey, we love that, you know, that the vice president who chairs these other committees is doing work out in the field and really representing the field employees. So we have a board, every owner is on the board. And like, what's a board decision and what we vote on is always an interesting one. There are actually like a few bullet point ones that we hit is like, hey, these are really what the board votes on, like incoming members, the allocation amount at the end of the year, like kind of these big buckets. And facilitating those meetings has been a real big learning process for me. It was really hard, especially at first, to have to share these decisions that I felt like, I'm not used to this. I'm used to being the boss. I don't really like sharing this. It was so much better when I could just tell everybody what to do. And now all of a sudden, like sometimes decisions are being made that I'm like scared. So I'm like, this is so wrong. And I'm like, life goes on and it's great and it's probably fine. And so for me personally, it has been an incredible journey and transformation and appreciation for the democratic process, honestly, is what it is. So.
Yeah, and I'll say there are things called democratic ESOPs, but it's a small portion of you that try to mimic some of the democratic member control that shows up in a worker cooperative. But in ESOPs, typically ownership is financial ownership, it's not control. Whereas in a worker cooperative, it's employee ownership and control. Let's see here. You know, sometimes we get approached by employees who are interested in suggesting this model to the owner of the business that they work for, either because they think that person might exit or they're just interested in what a more democratic workplace could look like. From your perspective, you know, how can employees or how should employees think about approaching company ownership to initiate this conversation?
I love this question, but it kind of scares me because you never know, like you're not going to know as the owner where it's coming from, right? Is it because, you know, so-and-so thinks I'm doing a terrible job or they think the company's not run well? I would say if I were an employee and I were going to approach my employer, you would need to really understand the culture of the company. Do you feel like you already have an open democratic culture? And that doesn't mean that you don't have one boss, but are ideas appreciated? Are they solicited? And if you already don't feel like that culture exists, I think that it's probably less likely that ownership or management is going to consider a worker co-op or an ESOP. And so for the employee first, I would say, you know, evaluate your culture. Do you feel like that already exists?
Thanks.
Yeah, I would just agree with that 100%. You got to have the culture there. And in my case, I actually went to the employees first and said, do you guys want to do this? Like, this seems really awesome and it could be amazing. And their response was like, if you're leaving, Marty, we're not doing this. Like,
you know it's right.
Yeah, what's that?
Then you know it's right because they wanted you to stay. You had the right culture.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So it depends on the culture, right?
Yeah. And so this leads into another question of how did you educate your employees on employee ownership, or how did you introduce the idea to employees? I think what you said, Marty, of like, oh, if you're going, we're not sure we want, often that first conversation can be a little scary for everyone. And so could you each touch on how you approached that, opening up that conversation about ownership with your teams?
The first conversation that Mark and I had was with the 4 key back office players at our company. That team has grown to 5 or 6 now, but there were 4 at the time. And we basically gave them letters saying, welcome to the ownership team. This is what we're planning on doing. We didn't ask them in advance because we were afraid if we let the cat out of the bag and then it didn't work, like if we couldn't get the loan or whatever reason, we thought that it would be detrimental to the culture. So we told them first, and then we brought all of the store managers and assistant managers together. And walked them through the process, made it a very big party. You'll see we took great photos, we had prizes, we had t-shirts and buttons, like we made it very festive with the 401k company there to really answer the nitty gritty. Because at the time, I don't think Mark and I were well enough first to be able to stand up in front of the audience and give the details. And then we rolled it out to the entire company with backed up documentation that we have in our handbook and we have in our payroll program so everyone can access it.
Great, thank you. How about you, Marty?
I rolled it out with a couple of three employees who had been there almost from day one with me and said, hey, what do you guys think of this? Here's kind of what I've learned about it. Here's what I don't know. Are you guys at all interested? Should we research it more? And then we just kind of kept digging a little deeper, scratching a little more, calling more folks, bringing in some consultants. And then eventually we brought it to I think the whole company and said, hey, this has got a lot of traction. Let's start talking about what bylaws might look like. And it was a couple-year process for us. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
I'm going to borrow that pie idea, Gina.
That was great.
I'm going to do that for the next incoming owner. I'd love that. That's so cool.
Thanks.
I just want to acknowledge, I know there are several questions in the Q&A box about grocery co-ops and worker co-ops within grocery co-ops. That's a super complicated conversation. And none of our speakers, as far as I know, are grocery co-op experts. So I just want to acknowledge them. I'm not intentional, I am intentionally ignoring them. Happy to have that conversation after the webinar. But I think we could go down a rabbit hole pretty easily there. So let's see here. What other?
Courtney,
Yes.
Courtney, I see two questions that I can answer really quickly.
Oh,
One is a comment that says employee ownership is not a magic bullet for saving a business that is not profitable, and that we need to say that 100%.
Yes.
Employee ownership will not fix it. Employee ownership on its own will not take a good business and make it better without a lot of work. So it is not a silver bullet. And I think the most important thing to know is, yes, it does have to be a profitable business. It has to support the cash flow to pay someone back. And then the second question someone said was to learn more about acquisitions. I think we're really starting to talk more specifically in the Esop world about growing employee ownership through acquisitions. And so businesses like Marty's don't just have to shut down if they can't get a personal guaranteed loan for their managers to buy it when Marty leaves. We're trying the best through our network of state centers. We're creating a list of businesses who are employee owned, who would be glad. I could see a construction company, Marty, saying, you know what, we'd love to take in a great company like yours and do a remodel division and put it inside of a construction company. So it's a new concept, in my mind, a new concept that's really being talked about a lot. Because there are some small businesses that don't have a democratic workplace and could fit into an ESOP. So
Yeah.
Or merge with another worker cooperative too. I've never seen that either, but I think we're going to see more and more mergers and acquisitions inside of the employee ownership community to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to thank Nancy for her comment. I was going to read that at the end. Just I know we've talked about all the positives here, but it's not a silver bullet. Again, like Steve said, turning something into an employee-owned company doesn't fix a company that's losing money, doesn't plug those holes. So we have just a couple more minutes. So Marty and Gina, if each of you could just reflect on, what's one thing you think folks should know about your experience converting or starting the process of converting your business to an employee-owned business. Maybe one of the highlights, one of the positive things, and one of the challenges folks should be aware of.
Well, gosh, I'm by nature a very curious person, and I'm also very I was going to say tolerant, and that's a dumb word to use. You have to be curious because there's so much you don't know. And I mean, I really had to pretend like I was starting from ground zero of any kind of business ownership valuation knowledge. And I did. I also have to be very cognizant of my feelings when it comes to talking about, when you've been the CEO of a business for 19 years and all of a sudden you're supposed to start sharing it. It didn't matter how open I was. I mean, I think we have a fantastic culture, but there is a nuanced switch when I now say I am the CEO and co-owner, or, I mean, I've always called my teammates. I've never called them employees, but there are a lot of things like that if you are not already doing that in your culture, you have to start thinking about, because it really impacts how you go to market with this new concept and the benefits you can get from it from a PR perspective and employee retention. And being sincere with your intentions, I think is the big thing. And I think that that's probably one of my strengths, but even so, it's been a struggle, and it will continue to be, I think. Yeah. And I hope that answers your question, Courtney.
Sure. It's great. Thank you. Marty, any final word?
You know, I think if you're an entrepreneur and you have a business, and you're going to be a risk taker. That's what we are. That's the definition. Like, you're going to jump off the cliff and not know how far you're going to go. And that's just what we do. And we love it. And it's a sickness and a great thing that we do. And I think going into employee ownership is no different. Like, you're just going to jump into something and you'll be like, I think it's going to work. I think my gut says it's the right way to go. That's the great thing of it. I recommend it. The hard part is, like, I think it's when you're used to really being in charge in all aspects, and so you got to share it. Like, that's talking about stretching your growth there. That's it. So yeah, that's it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're at time. Steve, Marty, Gina, really appreciate your participation. Gina and Marty, thank you so much for telling your stories. This is often the way that people start their journey, is hearing someone else's stories. Those stories are really powerful. I want to also acknowledge that there were a lot of questions about the specifics, the details, and we were really focused on the story here. So if you have, if you feel like your question wasn't answered, please don't hesitate to reach out to Steve, to reach out to me, and probably to Gina or Marty too, because we know that, you know, the devil's in the details. And if you're interested in continuing this conversation, we'd be happy to be thinking partners with you. So again, thank you. And thanks for coming to the webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.